Here we go. All right. So today we have a lecture by Matt Huber, who is an associate professor of geography at Syracuse University in upstate New York, and a member of the Syracuse Democratic Socialists of America. Matt has written the book Climate Change as Class War, published by Verso in 2022, and translated into Dutch as Klimaatverandering als Klasseoorlog, published by EPO in 2024. In today's session, I suppose Matt will tell us about the main ideas from this very book, but I would recommend reading it to, well, to everyone interested in both the topics of climate change and the class struggle, which I suppose will be most people present right now. So with that, I would say, Matt, you have the floor. Take it away.
Thank you, Emil. Thanks so much for the invitation. I did want to bring up, I just ran away to find it because the book has been translated into Dutch. So you can get it from, I believe the publisher is EPO. And so if you don't want to read English, it's available. So thanks again for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen. So yes, like he said, I'm just going to try to give the sort of overview of the book, and then hopefully we'll have time for discussion. You know, about 5 years ago, things kind of looked more optimistic when it comes to climate change. The US had elected a president with the most ambitious climate plan of any candidate in history. Biden's climate plan was shaped by the climate movement, the Sunrise Movement, and the architect of the Green New Deal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He did sort of announce this very ambitious whole of government approach to the climate crisis, pledged to slash greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and decarbonize the entire electricity grid by 2035. Yet, if we fast forward to 2025, obviously things have gone horribly awry, and I would argue they started going awry long before the election last year. In 2022, boom times returned to the fossil fuel industry. Oil and gas firms were reporting their best profits in nearly a decade. And not just oil and gas, coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels, saw its prices and profits surge. Um, in 2023, the Financial Times reported on this hedge fund investor in coal that said it's almost immoral not to invest in coal because of other countries' reliance on fossil fuels. This same investor, this hedge fund investor, was making 43% returns on these coal investments. So these are the type of people we are up against, people making enormous profits off of fossil fuels. And many of the fossil fuel companies did make these very kind of ambitious so-called net zero pledges in 2020. By now, it's very clear all of them are just completely backing down from any kind of commitment. And there's another book out now called Overshoot by Andreas Malm. And the subtitle, and Wim Carton, I should add, the subtitle is How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown. And that's clearly what's going on right now. And meanwhile, the Biden administration did pass, at least in US context, the most significant climate legislation in our history. But to me, it was very much a continuation of a kind of neoliberal approach to climate policy that just hopes we can kind of nudge and use incentives to nudge the private sector, private investors, private consumers, and markets more generally towards these kind of green solutions. And of course, Biden oversaw actually a massive expansion of oil and gas production, and emissions have basically barely budged over the Biden years. And of course, now they're probably set to increase with Trump in power. And that is what we're facing right now. I think the Biden kind of climate and economic program was meant to kind of win back the working class, but of course, Trump won the popular vote for the first time in his political career. And this was an event he held just a couple weeks ago. And I think one of the main arguments in my book is that actually the right is way more uses class politics in the climate fight way more effectively. This is an event where he announced that they were going to reopen coal mines and reopen coal power plants. And of course, you see the very sort of visible class, working class imagery of the workers behind him, the coal workers supporting him in this effort. So what can we make of this apparent impasse of fossil fuel production gone wild alongside political inaction and cascading climate disaster? At its core, our problem can be boiled down to this: those that profit from the production of fossil fuels are going to continue to do so unless society can force them to stop. So this is fundamentally a power struggle, a question of power. And in the book, I argue that it's fundamentally a class issue. It's an issue of who owns and controls the means of energy production and to what end. And it will require a class struggle to solve. So in the talk, I want to go through the book's structure in three parts, which focuses on three basic classes at the core of climate politics today. First, I argue it's the capitalist class that we really need to see as responsible for the crisis. Second, I focus on the professional class, which really is the class that drives climate policy advocacy and political activity. And then there is the working class, who has both the power in numbers as the majority of society and the strategic capacity to shape the energy transition through labor and union organizing within the kind of very energy sectors that we need to transform. The core argument of the book is that in order to take on the entrenched power of the first of these classes, the capitalists who control our energy system, we really need a mass movement that appeals to the vast majority of society and the working class. Ultimately, I argue we need to build a much more popular, majoritarian, and democratic approach to climate politics, and the professional class form of climate advocacy is uniquely bad at this. Now, I'm going to take a deeper dive into how we can understand this idea of class and how it shapes our thinking on climate politics. The idea that climate change is a problem of class inequality has attracted wide attention as of late. In 2015, Oxfam released a report entitled Extreme Carbon Inequality that found the top 10% of people are responsible for 50% of the emissions. Thomas Piketty, the famous analyst, economist of inequality, found similar numbers. I just saw there's a new study in Nature that came out, I think, yesterday, which is the same kind of numbers. But what I really want to hone in on is that all these studies share this focus on what the Oxfam reports called lifestyle consumption emissions. This study talked about this kind of polluter elite, which is defined by these kind of wealthy lifestyles of rich people sort of consuming in this way. This study kind of uh, did a rundown of the lifestyle consumption decisions and changes you can make to your lifestyle and behavior that can have an impact on the climate. And they found the most powerful thing you can do is not have children. And it became widely reported on in 2018. And so what I want to suggest is that this way of thinking about class and climate responsibilities got some problems, and it shares two fundamental assumptions. First, they assume class inequality is based only on one's wealth, income, and lifestyle and consumption practices. Second, and more perniciously, they link emissions and thus carbon responsibility to these same consumption and lifestyle practices. This is based on a method called carbon footprint accounting, a metric that allows people to input their consumption practices, the car they drive, the meat they eat, the children they rear, into a calculator which can precisely determine how many pounds of carbon they emit per year. And to take a step back, theoretically speaking, this way of thinking about class combines kind of two common sociological approaches. The first is simply linking class to one's income. And of course, one's income determines how much they might consume in the economy. And you can, of course, divide society into a sort of upper, middle, and lower class based on this kind of income data. And I think a lot of this kind of carbon footprint accounting is based on the data we have on people's incomes and their implied consumption practices from that. But insofar as we often imply carbon responsibility is wrapped up in one's carbon footprint, this way of thinking about class also relies upon a second common sociological approach, which is that class is theorized more as a kind of cultural status and defined by characteristics like education, manner of speaking, neighborhood you might live in, how you dress. In this case, those of us with the means are able to kind of perform a certain kind of classy climate awareness by adopting the latest virtuous low carbon consumption practices. And this is kind of a sign of our sort of aware climate um, uh, action. So this linking of emissions to consumption-based footprints is so entrenched in the analysis, it's rarely questioned. Even socialists who often talk about climate change as a class struggle tend to rely on this data that looks at the rich's consumption practices. But this is a very impoverished way of thinking about class. By placing responsibility for emissions solely on consumers, it accepts a theory of consumer sovereignty that's rooted in neoclassical economics and neoliberal ideology. This theory would have us believe that it's really dispersed consumers who have all the power in our economy, and it's not the concentrated power of corporations who control the production of energy. Now, I don't have to tell you all, but there are, of course, other ways of thinking about class that do not primarily focus on your income, consumption, and lifestyle choices. A more traditional socialist understanding of class centers not on consumption at all, but on production, and class is classically defined as your relationship to the means of production. And that, I think that sounds old-fashioned to some, but I would argue the climate struggle is ultimately about this. It's about industrial production. It's not only how we produce energy, but it's the industrial forms of production are the largest source of emissions. One estimate suggests that just steel and cement production alone are responsible for about 15 to 20% of global carbon emissions. This is an intergovernmental panel on climate change data. As you can see, the industrial sector itself is, if you include the electricity consumption they do, they are the largest source of emissions globally, a little over a third. But what's more interesting is if you kind of combine industry, food, and agriculture and land use and electricity production, it's nearly 70% of emissions are rooted in how we organize production, whether it be agricultural production, industrial production, or electricity production. So it's really a problem of production. Also, I would add that under capitalism, production is really organized by a fundamentally different logic than consumption, right? Ownership of capital is seeking returns or profits on production, right? Investing money with the hope of making more money, whereas consumption is more using money to sustain our needs in the economy. So for the Marxists out there, production is often organized by an MCM prime kind of circuit where you're seeking surplus value and profits and accumulation. And consumption and the reproduction of the working class, more particularly, is more like a CMC circuit where you're selling your labor power for money and then using that money to acquire what you need in life. And obviously, some people have rich people like reproduce needs that are quite extravagant, but they're still kind of working on the CMC circuit. Yeah. So when we shift our class analytic to this lens to focus on production, ownership, and profit, we come to strikingly different conclusions about climate responsibility. First, we could point out that the entire idea of a carbon footprint was itself concocted by the very industry that's profiting off fossil fuels in the first place. A recent study asserts that the very notion of a personal carbon footprint was popularized by the firm British Petroleum in 2004 as part of their Beyond Petroleum campaign, and we're all still waiting for them to get beyond petroleum. Second, we should understand that every carbon footprint is not an isolated individual, but a web of relations wrapped up in production. So when you drive a car and emit carbon, the gasoline in your tank flowed through the hands of innumerable capitalists that seek profit off that exchange, right? Oil exploration consultants, rig service firms, pipeline companies, and gas station operators. Yet you are the one responsible for the footprint simply because you're at the end of that chain of relationships. Third, when we only focus on an individual rich person's lifestyle, we ignore how they became rich in the first place. So instead of tracking how rich people spend their money, I think the more socialist approach is to actually look at how they make their money, how they generate their money. And as it happens, that activity might have way more significant climate impacts. So you can take the CEO of a petrochemical company like this fella here, who we can imagine spends something like 8 to 12 hours a day helping to organize a global network of chemical factories that emit millions of tons of carbon dioxide per year. Their income and their stock options are primarily derived from that activity, planning and expanding chemical production for sale, for profit, right? Now we can imagine that this guy goes home in a large sports utility vehicle and eats a steak for dinner. But the question is, why is that activity, the driving and the steak, the only one that we focus on when we talk about carbon inequality? Surely the SUV and the steak are drops in the bucket compared to his everyday roles as kind of titan of chemical capital. To take it to another extreme, we could imagine this guy is a vegetarian, lives in a small apartment, takes public transit to his job, has a very low carbon footprint, yet no one would deny his role as an owner of capital, he is massively destructive on the climate, regardless of what his carbon footprint is. So the main culprits of the climate crisis are not simply rich, affluent consumers. Rather, it's a class. It's a class of people who profit from the production of things like aviation, automobiles, steel, chemicals, and other carbon-intensive sectors of capital. I think this actually clarifies our political task. Instead of this kind of moral project to convert the lifestyles of billions of dispersed consumers, we face a perhaps harder but more straightforward political project to erode the power of a class who controls and profits from production. So that's the first argument about the capitalist class and their responsibility for the climate crisis. The second is going to focus on the class who really drives climate politics itself. This is the professional class. This class is made up of credentialed degree holders like journalists, scientists, academics, and NGO staffers who are really the core of climate advocacy. This class also, I should add, happens to be the class most invested in this kind of moral politics of lifestyle choices and carbon footprints and all this kind of stuff. I should say that I proposed this book almost, 8 years ago now in 2017, and since then there's been a lot of debate and sort of controversy on this concept of the professional and managerial class, or what's often talked about online as the PMC. I want to make clear that I'm not trying to say there's an inherent problem with professional class people doing politics or doing socialist politics or environmental politics. And in fact, all powerful left-wing and socialist movements in history have always had layers of intellectuals and professionals and professional revolutionaries. But if professional class politics is actively antagonistic to the masses of working people, that's the problem I'm trying to point out here. I will also admit, since the book came out, I've come around to the idea that it makes my three-part structure not so clean and beautiful, but that really the professional class is not technically a class in the Marxist sense. It's better seen as a stratum of the working class. Professionals have to sell their labor and skills for a wage like all working people, but they are able to sort of create these privileges within the labor market. And really this kind of the education and skills they acquire represent one of the many divisions within the wider working class that really hinder working class solidarity and formation. So with all that throat clearing out of the way, what is the professional class? And I'm just going to use that term for now. I'm going to make three crucial points. First, the material project of the professional class is about marshaling credentials, things like degrees, licenses, and other things to carve out advantages in the labor market. Interestingly, the focus on educational attainment means the professional class is also ideologically attached to ideas of meritocracy, the idea that one's material position is dependent on their knowledge and smarts. Materially, this means the professional class project is ultimately one aimed toward achieving this kind of middle class level of economic security. Second, and perhaps most crucially, the professional class represents a relatively small percentage of society as a whole. This is from Kim Moody's book about the American working class, where he estimates professionals make up about 22% of the workforce. In the United States, only about, or actually 63% of Americans lack college education or what's called a bachelor's degree. So you can immediately sort of conclude that we're not talking about a majoritarian basis for a kind of mass political movement. And by the way, it's increasingly clear that this kind of educational divide between professionals and the wider working class is not just relevant to climate politics, but politics more generally. Some have called it this kind of diploma divide or educational polarization, or someone talked about class de-alignment, how it's the same story in both the United States and also European countries, where parties that used to be parties of the working class are now shifting their base more increasingly toward more affluent and highly educated professional types of voters, urban professional types of voters. These parties, like the Democrats, are likewise hemorrhaging non-college educated working class, particularly rural and industrial working class voters. These are the classes of workers that are shifting to the right in droves. Third, thinking of our definition of class as based on a relationship to production, the professional class is profoundly separated from material production and largely confined to what is often called the knowledge economy. The rise of professional class paralleled the decline of the industrial working class. Consequently, the professional class tends to view industrial production as purely a source of harm and environmental destruction, not as a system that the working class should seize and repurpose and control to provision social and ecological needs. Yet that is exactly what the climate crisis actually requires. So on this basis, we can identify two core approaches to professional class climate politics. First, it's deeply invested in a politics of knowledge, a politics of belief and denial in the science. This was in the first Trump term. There was something called a March for Science that could be seen as a kind of mass action of the professional class. Second, because of their relative material comfort and separation from production, professional class environmental politics is rooted in a kind of anxiety around their own consumption, or what I call in the book carbon guilt. At the core of professional class politics is this contradiction. It's based upon using credentials to attain economic security, but the forms of consumption attached to that security, things like single-family home ownership or car ownership or professional expectations of flight travel, these create tremendous feelings of ecological complicity while the world burns. This leads to the idea that they themselves are the core drivers of climate change and not the owners of capital detailed in the previous section. Rather than focus on those with the real power, professionals tend to blame themselves. So in the book, I categorize three core professional class types that have driven climate politics for the last several decades. And again, I'm trying to explain how each of these types espouses a climate politics that's kind of inherently antagonistic to the majority of working class people in our highly unequal and often barbaric form of neoliberal capitalism. The first type is what I call the science communicators, who are either natural scientists or otherwise deeply invested in knowing what the science has to say, like environmental journalists. This type of person believes the primary problem in environmental politics is the lack of awareness or outright denial of scientific knowledge. And it believes somewhat naively if the masses truly understood the science, then action would inevitably follow. It's kind of a very liberal theory of knowledge leads to action. But apart from that, it should be obvious that this kind of knowledge politics is not really speaking to the direct material concerns of the masses of working people. And I don't want to imply that working people, working class people don't understand climate science. I'm sure many do, but it still does not represent a kind of politics that has this sort of immediate day-to-day material appeal. The second type of professional class environmental politics is what I call the policy technocrat, whose expertise is more likely to be based in law or policy studies. They might work in think tanks, academia, or professionalized NGOs. These types seek to design smart policy solutions that use logic and rational policy design to sway politicians and the public towards them. For the last few decades, these technocrats have been most convinced they can design free market policies like carbon pricing to channel markets in the profit motive to allow the private sector to solve environmental problems. In the United States, they even subscribe to this, what I consider delusional idea that these solutions can be bipartisan, they can win over Republican support for their free market ideas because they are these kind of market-based, free market kinds of policies. And in the book, I profile this group called the Citizens Climate Lobby that's trying to pass something called a carbon fee and dividend, which is just a variation on a carbon tax or carbon pricing scheme. And if you can believe it, they actually have a slogan that is, "We're going to outsmart climate change," which to me sort of epitomizes kind of professional class climate politics, which is always based on the fact that we are very smart and that can solve it on its own. But we see how masses of working class people respond to these kinds of smart market-based policies. In a very kind of liberal environmental state of Washington in the United States, carbon tax put to the voters failed by large margins, both in 2016 and 2018. And as you all know, in France, we had something called the Gilets jaunes and the Yellow Vest movement, where there was kind of like a mass revolt against a carbon tax. And of course, this slogan, I think, really hit home for a lot of us that, politicians like Macron are worried about the end of the world, but we're trying to get to the end of the month. And it's really the failure of climate policy and advocacy to kind of reach people at that end of month type of level, the level of paying for rent and utilities um, and and uh, and so forth, is kind of, I think, really illustrative of the failures of the climate movement. And consequently, I would argue workers are increasingly receptive to the right-wing view that environmental policy is really out to harm their economic lives. And if anyone mobilizes, as I said before, if anyone mobilizes class politics in the climate fight, it's the right, who consistently talks about the economic consequences of climate policy. They talk about jobs, lost jobs, increased energy cost, and this is kind of their focus, right? This is a billionaire oil tycoon named Charles Koch of the Koch brothers, if you know them. And of course, in this interview, he's able to claim that he is very concerned about the poor, right? It's this billionaire worried about climate policy affecting the poor. Finally, the third type is the one I'm most familiar with, which is called the anti-system radicals, whose own exposure to the science of ecological collapse leads to a kind of political radicalization. Again, their professional class location creates a context of relative material and economic security, so they tend to focus most of their attention on the need to lessen consumption overall, or to what I call a politics of less. And I've had a lot of debates about this, but I argue in the book that this is epitomized by the degrowth movement, which, as one CNBC profile puts it, claims we're trying to live better with less. And I argue that this sort of aggregate focus on degrowth or reductions or less evades what I'm arguing for, which is a class struggle approach, which would say rather than needing to degrow in the aggregate or in general, a class approach would advocate degrowing capital, degrowing the capitalist class, so we can grow a lot of things for the working class, like green energy and public transit, public housing, and most importantly, a lot of working class people need to see growth in their access to the very basics of life. They struggle to obtain food and housing, and in my country, healthcare and things like this. And I think degrowthers support many of these ideas of universal public service, decommodifying the basic needs of life. But the whole movement and messaging is sort of shrouded in this focus on aggregate reduction or less. And again, while traditional working class politics aims to seize, transform, and repurpose existing industrial production systems, degrowth tends to promote small-scale alternatives to industrial society in general. Things like localizing farming and communal housing, decentralized solar co-ops, and this kind of stuff. Degrowthers suggest such small-scale prefigurative projects might slowly spread throughout society, but it's more realistic to imagine them forming these kind of local enclaves of professional class virtue while the rest of the world carries on as normal. And if the rest of the world carries on as normal, climate change and the ecological crisis carries on as normal. So in sum, I think it's worth mentioning that none of these movements are really succeeding in solving the climate crisis. So we're going to need a massive shift in strategy if we're going to be able to build a movement with the power to take on some of the most powerful and wealthy corporations in world history. And that's where the third class comes in, the working class. Again, this is largely a democratic argument, but it's not just an electoral argument. As you can see from this estimate, the working class is close to 2/3 of the working population. It's not just an electoral argument that mass support leads to the right politicians getting elected, but a more sort of socialist and Marxist point that really the road to power for any movement historically it is through mass action or through winning over the masses, right? And to quote Lenin, he talked about, we can't count our movement in thousands. We must count in millions and millions of people and build this kind of mass support for our program and our ideas, and develop kind of popular demands that sort of agitate for this kind of working class movement. So I would argue the first step towards a kind of working class climate politics is finding a way to counter the right-wing narrative that climate action is inherently against the interest of the working class. So if the working class has material interest, are there any ways in which we can conjoin those to a kind of ecological or climate interest? And I think that requires going back to the basic socialist definition of the working class or the proletariat, which is a class fundamentally separated from the means of production, a class that's historically only formed once it's expelled from the land and from any kind of ecological source of subsistence. And we can see once that happens, the working class under capitalism is shaped by this kind of fundamental proletarian insecurity in accessing the means of life. And I argue that this is profoundly ecological, that the working class, their ecological means of life is only accessed through the market, right? Through money and commodities. And this insecure life via the market is what I call proletarian ecology. And even in a rich country like the United States, there's this immense insecurity for the large majority of the working class, particularly, as I said before, this kind of non-college educated working class in the United States, which, by the way, is shifting to the right in massive numbers. So it should be clear that an ecological basis, that the working class has a material interest in more secure access to these basic needs of life. But I would argue it's convenient that these very basic working class needs, things like housing, energy, transportation, food, these are precisely the sectors that we need to aggressively decarbonize for the climate crisis. So if decarbonization were paired with cheaper or even free, or what socialists call decommodified access to these basic needs, I think it'd be possible to construct a more working class climate program. And note that the kind of interest in this climate action would have nothing to do with material sacrifice or knowledge of the climate crisis. It would appeal to people's basic so-called end-of-month material needs and build out popular mass appeal from that basis. So back in the day, this idea of a Green New Deal by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and even the Labor Party, I think it was an attempt to construct this kind of working class climate program. And personally, I think we should take note that it literally was inspired by the original New Deal, which was, with all its warts, was actually a massive deployment of public investment to improve the lives of very poor working class people, particularly in rural areas throughout the country. I think the Tennessee Valley Authority had a slogan, "Electricity for All," which actually sounds quite similar to kind of a Bernie Sanders type socialist slogan. The problem is, of course, is the theory of change of the Green New Deal is you actually have to deliver material gains to the working class for them to actually believe that climate action means real improvement in their lives. And this is the fundamental problem and challenge with a lot of this kind of insurgent left-wing politics, like Bernie Sanders' ill-fated campaigns, is the working class might agree with your program, but the main barrier to winning their support is they do not believe such a program like free healthcare and free college education or a Green New Deal is possible. They don't think it's possible to pull this off. As Vivek Chibber has recently argued, working class people under capitalism are more prone towards what he calls resignation, the feeling that things are bad, but there's really nothing we can do to change them. In many ways, the Green New Deal and Bernie Sanders movement was kind of a shortcut to building working class power. It seemed to think that an electoral campaign would kind of awake the sleeping giant of the working class from decades of atomization and demobilization. But history, like the 1930s, shows that typically you need working class organization that has to come first in the form of trade unions and political parties like your own. And it's only these kind of organized forms of power that can actually start to deliver real material gains to workers, build confidence amongst the working class masses, and it's only that that's really going to convince them that they can fight and win better lives through struggle, right? That brings me to another key question of a kind of working class strategy for the climate, which is what should the role of unions be, and how can workers use their strategic power in the workplace and at the point of production to go on strike, to shut down capital's source of profits, and to create a crisis and all this kind of stuff. The first thing we should say is, I think still today, it's clear that capitalism creates a structure where workers have unique and strategic power that no other force in society can replicate. An example, in 2018, the West Virginia teachers went on strike. They shut down the entire state school system, and with it, a critical site of social reproduction and obviously childcare for a lot of people. And in so doing, they created a massive crisis that forced elites to respond to this teachers' strike movement. And they won their very radical progressive demands in 2 weeks in a right-wing state of West Virginia. And that is the power that working class people have if they use it. This last fall, we saw the longshoremen workers go on strike and win a 62% raise. And I often ask people if they have gotten a 62% raise recently. Boeing workers went on strike and won a 35% raise in a tentative agreement. Perhaps most inspiring was in the fall of 2023, where the United Auto Workers waged this kind of very strategic so-called stand-up strike that was estimated to cost General Motors $800 million at one point. So this is, again, the power that workers have. They can impose real cost on capital by withdrawing their labor. And this record contract that the UAW won from this strike led directly to the UAW then winning the first ever union election in a southern auto plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee last spring. They also have lost elections, and it's not easy. It still fits and starts, but I think that the strike followed by the union victory showed the way in which winning can build power and confidence amongst workers. The problem is that it's almost as if workers in the labor movement have forgotten about the power that they have. Since Ronald Reagan broke the PATCO strike, the Professional Air Traffic Controller strike in 1981, since then, capital has waged an all-out war against organized labor, and strike activity, at least in the United States, has fallen off a cliff. A union leader told the late, great Jane McAlevey that going on strike is like a muscle. If you don't use it, it's going to atrophy and go away. And that's clearly what's happened to workers in the United States. Now, in the environmental movement, there's a lot of consternation about the negative role that the labor movement and unions play in kind of resisting the decarbonization agenda. The unions tend to prioritize good unionized jobs no matter what the ecological consequences. But I would argue it's not as if neoliberal austerity offers much of a safety net to these workers. And when coal mines and power plants are shut down, there's nothing but kind of economic devastation in their wake. So again, it's this kind of proletarian insecurity that causes workers rationally and unions to choose jobs over the environment every time. So the standard left response to this is that we got to create something called a just transition. The idea that displaced workers in dirty industries should be given support to transition into new and cleaner industries. The problem is that most fossil fuel workers have never heard of a just transition, and communities, again, hollowed out by coal mine or coal power plant closures, they don't believe there's anything like a just transition. All they see is mass unemployment and devastation. We should not forget that the idea of a just transition came from a legendary union leader and environmentalist named Tony Mazzocchi. And it's often forgotten that Mazzocchi modeled his idea on a policy during the kind of last hurrah of the New Deal in the United States, something called the GI Bill. Over nearly 3 decades, this legislation helped more than 13 million former soldiers or veterans transition into the civilian economy and find employment, get free education, get subsidized housing. So rather than sloganeering, a real just transition would need to be this kind of massive public sector effort that actually convinces the affected workers that there's these real material supports for them as we transition the economy away from fossil fuels. Just transition politics also asserts a very limited vision of working class power. It imagines workers more as victims in need of support, rather than the actual agents of transformation that can actually ignite the transition itself. Because of course, the problem with this idea of a just transition is the transition is not happening, right? We basically for the last several decades been kind of stuck globally at about 80% of global energy consumption still comes from fossil fuels. So I would argue we need to see the workers in these industrial systems more as agents than as victims. And a union-based climate strategy should also recognize that certain sectors of the economy are more strategic to organize than others. Again, Jane McAlevey recounts how the famous Congress of Industrial Organizations organizers in the 1930s, they really targeted certain industries like steel, coal, automobiles. And today she says the labor movement should also kind of focus on what she calls strategic sectors of the economy to organize in. She argues healthcare and education and logistics are strategic. But for climate change, there's actually one sector of the economy that really is more important than any other, and it's the electricity sector. For any model towards decarbonization goes through electricity. Basically, the electrify everything strategy means basically we have to clean up the electric power sector and then electrify things that don't currently run on electricity, like residential heating, transportation, and industrial heat. Yet, few climate activists have pointed out that in the United States, the electric utility sector is one of the most unionized in the entire economy. And so the workers in these unions, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the Utility Workers Union of America, these could be sort of rank and file workers at the core of this transition to a different energy economy. So I argue the climate movement, if it wants to get serious, has to really win these unions to their side in order to transform the very strategic sector at the core of the solution. I do think my book was somewhat narrow on electricity and electricity workers. It's very clear if we're going to solve climate change more broadly, it's going to require a lot of different types of workers, industrial workers, manual workers. It's really going to be what the Labour Party in the UK called a green industrial revolution. So we got to have workers in the building trades, construction workers, and all types of different workers to kind of build an entirely new infrastructure system for electricity, transport, housing, and more. And while the climate movement often comforts itself that it can build a labor movement for climate only among kind of low carbon workers and, like teachers and nurses, I argue we really can't ignore the workers that are really in the belly of the beast in the industrial system we need to transform. So the book sort of maps out two ways to go about this. There's a socialist and radical strategy that is called the rank and file strategy that says that we need people to join these unions and kind of build militant layers within these unions to actually transform the unions themselves, because a lot of these unions are quite conservative and not particularly democratic. And actually, in the United Auto Workers, that had that really legendary strike a couple years ago, they had done this rank and file approach where they had activists that were agitating for changing the rules of how leaders are elected in the UAW, and that they formed this reform caucus called United Auto Workers for Democracy, and they were able to reform the rules, and then in doing so, they actually elected their radical caucus leadership in the form of Sean Fain to the presidency of the union. And then, of course, once he became president, he sort of revived this kind of class struggle rhetoric and politics into the union and waged this strike that won them this record contract. Second, in the absence of this kind of rank and file transformation, climate activists and eco-socialist campaigns really should center existing unions in building their campaigns and demands. And campaigns that do this, that harness the existing power and industrial expertise of the unions themselves, have seen tremendous success. In Maine, a labor union-based coalition won a Green New Deal program in the state legislature. A climate jobs bill also won in Illinois, with unions basically helming the campaign. But too often, though, climate activists conclude that unions are too problematic or too anti-climate to even bother with, and they end up ignoring these unions and kind of sidelining them. And this is an example that I think is really inspiring, which is the AOC and Bernie Sanders talked about a Green New Deal for public housing. But if you look at all their signatories or sponsors for this legislation, it's really a bunch of NGOs, and the only unions that are involved are very professional class unions, that grad students, teachers, and healthcare workers. They're not the trades workers that are going to be needed, the actual people that you would need to build a Green New Deal for public housing. And I think climate activists can make a case to these unions. We can point out that the renewable energy industries like solar and wind are actually notoriously anti-union and non-union, and are almost entirely run by private capital. So climate activists should argue that these unions need to really think strategically about making sure this energy transition is a union-led transition. Otherwise, they're going to be kind of eviscerated or destroyed by a kind of Wall Street-led green renewable capitalism. Finally, and more broadly, I think we don't really solve climate change unless we rebuild the labor movement in general as the only fighting force with the social power to take on capital at a societal scale. So I actually don't see any kind of climate movement narrowly conceived winning on climate alone. What I see as more likely is a much broader kind of anti-austerity movement calling for large-scale investments in public goods. While it's easy to see how climate investments could fit into this agenda, like transit and electricity and housing, I think there's much needed in society that wouldn't be totally relevant to climate, like expanding childcare and healthcare, just to name a couple. But at its core, solving climate change will really require incredible levels of investment. As Brett Christopher's new book shows, capital really isn't willing to provide this investment, and that's the core problem. So we need to build a force in society that's able to wrestle control over a portion of society's surplus to force this level of investment, and that's not going to be easy. So to conclude, there's one last motto of traditional working class politics we should talk about, which is internationalism. The famous socialist anthem, the Internationale, claimed to unite the human race. And in the face of the prospect of human extinction, I think we need a new kind of ecological internationalism that's rooted not only in emancipating and uniting, but also saving humanity from planetary ruin. While ecological politics often points toward reuniting local communities with local ecologies or returning to the land, a proletarian ecological internationalism would have to be planetary in scope. And again, Marx and others believed that the fact that the working class was itself torn from the land and any kind of direct local or parochial concerns, that's what made the proletariat the so-called universal class. The class that could indeed unite and emancipate humanity as a whole, the so-called last class, to abolish class entirely. And I think we can assert a kind of wider human interest in the core issue of climate change, which is energy. In particular, we need to recognize what some organizers have talked about, which is really we need to see electricity as a human right. There's currently around 700 million around the planet who have zero electricity access, but the amount with more limited access is even more staggering. There's an energy analyst named Robert Bryce who did this calculation that's showed that his refrigerator consumes more electricity per year than about 3.3 billion people. So about 35% of the planet that consumes less electricity than your refrigerator. So I think that brings us to the end where we can go to our comrade Lenin here, who's we should not forget his revolutionary project took place in a rural country where many lacked access to basic modern amenities, which led him to famously say that communism equals Soviet or worker power plus the electrification of the whole country. And I think we can kind of resurrect this kind of working class emancipation politics through energy systems, which is the core of the climate struggle, to stave off climate disaster and like make this a more international type of politics that really would appeal to billions around the world who really lack access to electricity and so forth. So I will stop there and thank you very much.